think about the value of the open sourceness of it, right? Like what is the specific value that people are getting from that? So the problem we were solving was like, it's searching across your stuff that's in your Dropbox and your Google Drive and like your
Got it.
Trello and your GitHub, like all of your, things that are
Mhm.
in different places. So that's a problem we were trying to solve. What you include in open source and what you charge for, it completely depends on like what the product is and what they use, how people consume it and what they want it for, right? There are actually hundreds of academic papers that cite Rasa. So lots of people use it for interesting, academic applications, which are things that I never would have dreamt of myself in
Mhm.
100 years. It's even more interesting because now you're saying, okay, well, actually, why am I typing at all? Can I like
Correct.
help? Can you help me navigate this app and send me to the right place? Or I have a contextual question about the screen that I'm on, right? And I don't understand what it is, or it's bugging out, or whatever it is. That's a very rich and interesting experience that you can start to build.
Welcome to Leading with Data, a podcast where we interview the top leaders in AI and share their perspective with you. Today, I have with me Alan Nichol, who is currently the CTO and co-founder of Rasa, the popular conversational AI framework. I came across Rasa a few months after ChatGPT was launched as it became trendy in our community discussions. During the podcast, we talked about Alan's and Rasa's journey and the role of open source in that journey. We then talk about his views on how conversational AI will evolve in coming years, and specifically how he sees voice as the mode of interaction with machines in future. Later, we talk about his leadership style and how he manages his current team and responsibilities. If you are someone interested in conversational AI and generative AI, you just cannot miss this discussion. Let's get started.
Hi, Alan, and welcome to the show.
Hey, Kunal, thanks for having me.
Great. So, Alan, let's start with hearing your journey from your perspective. So, can you share how you post your graduation in university? How did you kind of reach where you are, and what were the significant milestones during this period from your perspective?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I graduated a while ago now, so it's I'll try and keep it short. But
Sure.
so I trained as a physicist, and I studied physics, and then my PhD was about applying machine learning to physics, to simulating small molecules, and
Yeah.
just really got very excited about that field and thought it was very interesting, and actually realized that I was more interested in the machine learning than I was in the physics at one point.
Okay. Interesting.
And so it was kind of going down that route at the time. This was 2014. I finished up in 2015. So just to give you a sort of rough sense of
Yeah.
timeline. So
And this
this was,
was University of Cambridge, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this was when there was, the first big successes with like large neural networks, and trying to understand what these models were doing, and like
Right.
object detection in videos, some cool papers coming out here and there. So it was really like early days, and word detect, was the cool thing. We could do NLP now with this like word detecting.
Right.
So that's sort of the rough timeline of when I got interested in that, and then really got interested in the NLP side. I started
Mhm.
working on search. So I was working on a search product with a friend of mine, and it was like a personal search engine, right? And it just sat.
Mhm.
It was like a browser extension. It would pop up like a little spotlight search, and you could just search your
Interesting.
stuff across, the different apps that you use for work.
And
I worked on that for a while.
you were trying to solve this because you felt there were limitations in, let's say, Google search or Elasticsearch at that time, or was this just a kind of side project and you were still exploring the opportunity?
I would say yes to both.
Okay.
I mean, so the problem we were solving was like, it's searching across your stuff that's in your Dropbox and your Google Drive and like your
Got it.
Trello and your GitHub, like all of your things that are
Mhm.
in different places. So that's a problem we were trying to solve. And it's funny because you can kind of set your watch to it. Like every 6 months, somebody tries to
Right.
build this startup, and it
Yeah.
always ends the same way, right?
Till now.
But yeah, till now, yeah, maybe one day. But I fundamentally believe it's not an execution thing, although many people have executed much better than we did on it. It's just like people just don't care all that much about this, right? So anyway,
Interesting.
worked on that for a while, and I got interested in search and like going deeper into language, and that kind of naturally gravitated towards being interested in like multi-turn conversation, right? Because people ask one thing and then they have clarifying questions and they ask all sorts of things. And so we were kind of building different products. And one of the products we built was a chatbot for Slack that you could plug into Slack. And we were selling it to marketing teams and you could ask questions. So this was like English to SQL, which lots of people are working on now. At the time, we were doing that. And so you could ask questions about like your marketing data. You could say like, what was the, how many campaigns have I been running this month? You could ask really sophisticated questions, right? You could say things like, what was the ROI on all my campaigns by country for the last 3 weeks or something like that. But
And this
very
was the
quickly
period
realized,
where NLP wasn't. So I mean, so 2013, the ImageNet thing happened. So NLP at this time was still largely traditional way of doing it. So and deep learning was just getting in. So from a technology perspective, these chatbots were still powered by like the traditional NLP, or was this deep learning based systems which you were building?
yeah, well, a lot of these models were built on like Word2Vec as the sort of
Okay.
embedding
Yeah.
representation. So I mean that's sort of by definition a very shallow model. So I won't call that deep
Right.
learning, but it has
Sure.
elements of some of the same techniques that we use today, right? Those embeddings and then like training models on top of those embeddings. And so I would say it was kind of the early days. Like RNNs were very much a thing at the time, so people were
Right.
training recurrent nets, but training those things from scratch was a lot of work and
Yeah.
required a lot of data, and obviously the ecosystem of libraries wasn't as mature at the
That's
time,
not
right? We
sure.
didn't have
Yeah.
PyTorch, we didn't have TensorFlow.
Correct.
Like
Yeah.
there were lots of things around, but it wasn't the same
And
like today where you
I
have
think
Keras and
Spacey would have just started becoming popular around the same time
yeah,
as well.
yeah.
Yeah.
But Spacey was obviously a big inspiration for me
Correct.
personally. I mean, it's a great library, great team.
Yeah.
But anyway, so we could answer these really sophisticated questions, and we realized that our users would never ask them because if somebody asked a question like what I just said, they could also just write the query themselves, right? So what
Right.
people would ask is like, oh, how's my Twitter doing,
Yeah.
right? And then you realize you have to have a back and forth. You have to have a
Back and
conversation with
forth.
people,
Correct.
and
And
you know there were all these libraries out there for building chatbots, but there were really only libraries for building like the hello world,
hello.
right? Like this
Correct.
is here's how you do your first chatbot. And we said, okay, well, yeah, that can't be this can't be the answer to how we build these things, right? There has to be something better, more sophisticated. So that was sort of how we ended up on that journey. And
Yeah.
interestingly enough, actually, there was a bunch of research that inspired the early versions of Rasa that happened in my old department in Cambridge, but I actually didn't know that work existed at the time. I only discovered it afterwards. I started reading all these papers. I was like, oh, those people were like one floor above me in my old office, but I didn't know they
Okay.
existed at the time. But
Interesting.
yeah.
Okay. And then how did Rasa start? And then in between, you were doing Tree as well.
That
So
was the
how
search. That was the search
that
startup,
was the search
and
part. Okay. Interesting.
and when we realized it just wasn't like a killer problem that people cared about, we also stopped working on it, right? Because you can write code until you're blue in the face, but if people don't care,
Yeah.
it doesn't help. Um, and so yeah, so we were starting to build these chatbots. We were seeing that there wasn't anything beyond the here's how you do your very first thing, right? How do you build something more advanced? And then at the same time, there's just lots of interest. This was like the first chatbot hype wave coming,
Yeah.
2016. Satya Nadella at the time was saying chatbots are the new apps. He was
Right.
maybe ahead of his
Yeah.
time, but he said a thing.
Yeah.
And we just saw this opportunity and we started a meetup. And so we started a meetup
Interesting.
for developers who were building chatbots. And everybody kept telling us, oh, we're going to go do our own NLP.
Okay.
Because
Interesting.
everyone was using these APIs at the time, right? There was one that was like part of Google, there was one part of Facebook, there was one that was part of
Yeah.
Microsoft, and they had these like free APIs for like the language understanding part. That like
Right.
here's a user message, classify it, extract some entities, that kind of thing. And we said, okay, well, why? And it was always a pretty consistent answer, right? It was, well, I'm trying to build a startup in the space, and every single interaction with my app is going through a third party before I know
Right.
what the person is saying. And
Yeah.
it's free for now, but who knows for how long. And like,
Yeah.
I don't own the data, I don't control it. Like, this is a super risky situation to be in. So we don't have time now, but next month we're definitely going to do our own NLP. Everyone
But
kept saying
that
this.
never
No,
happened. Yeah.
nobody ever. Yeah, exactly. Nobody ever did it. So we
Yeah.
had like this really innocent idea. We said, okay, well, we built a pretty decent, NLP engine for chatbots. Why don't we just open source it, and then people can contribute to that rather than
Mhm.
everybody having to roll their own.
Right.
And it was just the right product at the right time. It was like, here's an open source drop-in replacement for any of these APIs. We even built like importers so you can import your projects from any of those and like migrate in less than a day, right? And you can
Mhm.
just be up and running, and like then you can control it, and you can systematically improve it and make it your own and change the algorithms or the embeddings or whatever. Um, and then all of a sudden, like every developer in the chatbot space knew what Rasa was. We're like, cool. So
Correct.
so we just doubled down
Yeah.
on that and built more for that movement.
Interesting. And from the point you decided that, this looks like a need everyone would have, but they're not
Mm.
explicitly expressing it, to the time
Yeah,
of open sourcing it, how long
yeah,
was this period? And what were your thoughts of, let's say, building a business around this? Or at that time you said, let's kind of open source and figure out the business. So how were
yeah,
you thinking about the business and the open source part, and in
for sure.
general, what did that period look like?
Yeah, yeah. So it was maybe about 4 or 5 months
Hmm.
between having that realization and shipping the first version of the library.
Hmm.
And um, well, one of the things that we did in the interim was I actually just published a blog post on like
Okay.
for everyone who
Hmm.
wants to do it yourself. It's like, here's how, right? Here was some example code. Here's how you can do it. And again, like it was at the time the most like widely read blog post I'd ever published at the time. And I was like, oh, this is cool. People are really interested. But again, I asked people around, I was like, did you actually use this code? And did you actually build something with it?
The answer
No.
was
So
no.
so you had to go a step further. It had to be like, fully polished up and ready to go, which I also understand people have better things to do than go and do this,
Right.
right? Um, and then we were kind of interested in this opportunity, and so we just reached out and talked to a bunch of open source founders. So we talked to
Hmm.
the folks from like Elastic and Influx and Mesosphere and HashiCorp and like just all the big success stories and MongoDB and
Yeah.
everyone. And
Hmm.
and we just wanted to talk to them. We're like, well, if we want to build an open source business, how do we do that? And
Yeah.
I mean, a couple of things we learned. Like one is pretty consistently is open source is an amazing distribution model, and it's a terrible monetization model,
Right.
unsurprisingly.
Yeah.
And it's but the other thing is that I think the split of like what you include in open source and what you charge for, it completely depends on like what the product is and what they use, how people consume it and what they want it for, right?
Hmm.
And so if I think about a product like MongoDB or Elasticsearch or any of these things, which are like a lot of the big success stories are like a persistence layer, right? Here's like a persistence
Yeah.
system. And they're like the value of having it hosted is just so massive, right? Because, you know, you just want to forget about it. You don't want to deal
Right.
with like backups and everything, right? Just
Yeah.
like, here, have it taken care of for me, right? Whereas something like Rasa, which is, it's a framework, right? It's sort of the outer loop of your application. It's not really something you consume as just a stateless API and you like send requests to it, right? It's like, well, this is how I'm building my application. So just
Right.
having that sort of running hosted somewhere isn't really like a big value proposition. It's not really how you consume the product. So every company has to kind of walk this balance themselves and sort of experiment and iterate and go back and forth on it to sort of find the right way to do it. So I don't think there's like an easy
Yeah.
universal answer for anybody, right? And you see this a lot with companies changing licenses or changing their approach over time or moving things around. So it's not a trivial thing to
Problem.
figure out.
Yeah. Yeah. And how did you do it? So were there some early, let's say, experiments, thoughts, and were there, let's say, pivots involved in terms of what
Yeah,
stays open source, and what features would come from
for
the
sure.
business aspect?
For sure, yeah. Always looking at that, always thinking about that, always trying to figure out like what's the right way to do things. what we saw very clearly early on is like we had this insane initial traction with Rasa
Right.
open source, right? And the first thing was like Rasa NLU, it was just the NLP stuff, and it just became ubiquitous just very very quickly. Just started replacing all those APIs. But what we very clearly saw as well was um, a lot of large companies adopting the software, and I think at the time kind of VCs, the popular thesis at the time was like startups can only win if they build like a vertical AI application, right? And you
Mm-hmm.
can't compete if you're trying to build something horizontal, like Google will do that or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and we said, well, actually, we don't think that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And we saw all these huge companies from all these like very different industries that were all like using our software, and they all wanted to talk to us, right? So
Right.
they were all sort of interested in what we had to do, and some were just looking for support, some were looking for extra functionality, right? Um, you know, some would say like, oh, well, do you have some kind of like secret model up your sleeve that's going to make my bot smarter or better, and like that I can pay for that, right? But I think that sort of goes against what makes the openness of Rasa so powerful, which is like there's no one size fits all better model, right? Like whatever the trade off is for you, right, between like latency and accuracy and language coverage and memory requirements and whatever else, right? And the other thing is that these like language models keep coming, right? So there's like word to vec, and then there was like glove, and then there were all these other exciting things, and then we got to the sentence level models, right? We got to like BERT and all the variations of BERT that came along, and then obviously GPT-2 and that whole categorization of models that came later. But um, you know, the space has transformed so many times that the only way to keep up is to build on an open platform that you can customize and make your own, right?
Correct. Mhm. Interesting. And from that period and talking to some of the most successful open source companies, and then
Mm.
by your own experience, any particular pieces of advice or things which you would share, let's say if someone wants to go on this journey, so they have, let's say,
Mm.
a side project which they've been working on, which could, let's say, resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah.
How or what are, let's say, top two three things which you would suggest them to keep in mind to navigate that period?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the first thing I would say is I would just reiterate what I said before, which is no one can give you this answer because it totally depends on like
Yeah.
what your product is and who uses it and how they consume it and what they're using it for. The other piece is, think about the value of the open sourceness of it, right? Like what
Mhm.
is the specific value that people are getting from that, right? Because sometimes it's just the thing that people want is like a free trial, which you don't
Yeah.
have to be open source to give a free trial, right? So that's a different way of
Correct.
thinking about it. Another way to think about it is that um, it's customizable, right? And for Rasa,
Mhm.
that's like a very big piece of it. That's actually probably the primary value because again, it's a framework, it's sort of the outer loop of your application. Sometimes you don't like an assumption that we make, you want to override it with your own. Good, go and do it, right? So
Yeah.
I think something like 90% of our enterprise customers have some kind of custom Rasa code. They have a subclass of something, they've modified it, tweaked it in some way to make it better fit their requirements, right? Which is amazing, and I think is a testament to why, Rasa wins out when people are stuck in these sort of pure SaaS, pure UI type of platforms. Um, but if you have like custom MongoDB code or something, you should fire VP engineering. Like, what are you doing customizing your database,
Yeah.
right? Like, what
Right.
something has gone very badly wrong. So for us, it's like it's very particular value that people can see and modify the code themselves. So think about specifically, why would open source make sense? Why is that more valuable? Are you going for like a bottoms up developer go to market? And then, in terms of a framework, there's at least one useful framework to think about, where you charge for something is to think about the separation between sort of technical complexity and organizational complexity, right? So if you're building a feature because it addresses some technical complexity in executing the thing that your product does, probably makes sense to be an open source. If you're building something because you're helping a large group of people organize their work in some sane way or be compliant with some requirements or deploy it in a way that makes sense for them, all those kinds of things, then that's probably the way to start thinking about monetization. The other thing I would really focus on is the mistake that we made early on was because you're early adopters in an open source product, by definition, they're innovators, they're pioneers, they're excited, they understand your
Right.
code, right? And they want to do everything themselves. So the temptation is you look at these people who are super advanced and they understand your product very well. And the temptation is to think, okay, well, what can I build that they don't feel that they could build themselves? Like what like magic thing? Like, and we had this, my co-founder and I were talking about this at the time. We specifically said, we should try and build features that only Rasa can build, which I would
Mhm.
completely scrap that if I were to start over.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't make any sense because like the much harder thing is to make it adoptable, right?
Right.
Because the open source piece, it never makes any assumptions about people's workflow. They just like import it, they use it however they want. And once you start adding like, and functionality for a team around it, then you've got all these requirements to think about, right? And so just figuring out that initial slice. And you know what? If 90% of people that you talk to say that's trivial, I'll build that myself, fine. So long as like the 5% who are like, oh yeah, that's worthwhile, there's actually
Mhm.
an easy path for them to adopt that functionality, right? And you iron out all the kinks of like getting installed, provisioned, who else needs to interact with this thing. That's actually the harder set of challenges. And then once you've got that wedge sorted out, then you can think about, okay, how do we increase the amount of value that we get from the proprietary product? But don't go build a bunch of fancy stuff and then send it over to people and then realize that like it doesn't work for them or it can't work for them, or you've got 2 years of like table stakes features that you still need to build before anybody can say, yes, I can actually use this, right?
Interesting. Interesting. And just there's actually more out of curiosity. What was the why, or what was the underlying reason why you were thinking that you should build products or features which only Rasa team could build? I mean, what
Mm.
led to that thinking? If you can share that.
Well, yeah. So we were talking to our like early adopters
Mhm.
who were necessary. They were data scientists, they were NLP people. They were very excited about it, and they understood it. We said, well, we have to charge them for something. We have to like build some kind of product that they're willing to pay us money for, right?
Got it.
And so we
Mhm.
said, okay, well, we don't want to get the answer like, oh, that's trivial, I can build it myself. But again, I think that's
Right.
a great answer to get if you get it most of the time, so long as you get the adoptability right.
Mhm.
That's actually, it's surprisingly like as a technical person, as a technical founder, you think, okay, the ML parts, those are the hard parts, the tricky parts to get right from a product perspective. Those are actually relatively straightforward because that's within your house. That's what you totally control.
Right. Interesting. Very interesting. In fact, I think there is a bunch of advice there. The framework of tech complexity versus organization complexity. Clearly, I think it's very
That's
useful to
blatantly
think
ripped
in
off
that way.
from HashiCorp, by the way. I got that from Nichol.
Okay.
So
Thanks for sharing. And once you released it and then you started seeing community traction,
Mhm.
what was the period where you were yourself, let's say, surprised by the growth, the use cases, the application? Because I'm presuming that's the phase which would have followed post the release and then the early iteration. So
For
what were
sure.
the
Yeah.
highlights during that period?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the highlights was when we released the first time we released a fully language agnostic version of Rasa that you could truly train on any language. Um, we got a community contributor just wrote a cool blog post about, hey, here I built a chatbot in Bengali, right? It was
Oh
like
wow,
2 days later, like 2 days.
interesting.
It was Suvik Ghosh, by the way. He works at Rasa now, so
Oh
it
wow,
was a long journey of
okay.
him being part of the
Mhm.
community, um,
Interesting.
and
Mhm.
that was very cool. What I also love is there are actually hundreds of academic papers that cite Rasa. So lots of people use it for interesting, academic applications, which are things that I never would have dreamt of myself
Mhm.
in 100 years, right? So there's a cool paper um, on using Rasa and a Rasa powered chatbot to like improve the well-being of chicken farmers in Tanzania,
Oh
and helping
wow.
them negotiate a better price for their product and those kinds of things. There was work on combating misinformation and depression during the pandemic. Some work done by
Wow.
the WHO, some studies that came out of China as well, working with teenagers, um, like fraud prevention, like public health and sanitation, prenatal care, like lots of really cool sort of public health. And that's obviously the magic and the power of open source is, none of those folks had to ask us for permission to use the product. And I never
Right.
in 100 years would have dreamt that those were use cases for the product we were building, because I don't have that domain expertise, right? I don't know those
Right.
opportunities. I don't see those things. But it's obviously very rewarding and very cool to see that, right? And then see those papers being published and citing Rasa, and you're like, oh wow, we had an impact on that. That's very cool.
Very interesting. And you know, fast forwarding to what Rasa is today, so how
Yeah,
would you describe the current offerings, current products? What is open source? What is, let's say, enterprise features? So how would you describe the
yeah,
overall ecosystem today?
yeah, yeah. So we have developed a new approach to conversational AI, right? We obviously got very far with the old like NLU based approach, and it's not
Yeah.
totally dumb. It is widely used for good reasons. But of course, with the new generation of LLMs, we saw there was an opportunity to do something different, right? And in many ways, I spent so much of my life thinking about, okay, we have these NLU systems. How do we build a really clever dialogue system that can deal with all the limitations of that NLU model, right? And so we've built lots of work, did lots of research, published papers, did all this work on like machine learning based dialogue management,
Yeah.
where the dialogue manager that says, okay, here's what I'm going to do next, it has to account for context and understand nuance and do all this kind of stuff. That's a really, really hard problem. And the short version of what you get with the new version of Rasa is that complexity goes away, and the LLM handles the complexity of like handling a conversation, and you just provide like, here's my business logic, like, and your business logic is just, hey, I'm going to do this thing for this user. I need these three pieces of information from them, and I need this piece of information from the API, and then I'm going to make one or two decisions, and then I'm going to go this way or that way, kind of thing, right? And in the past, you used to have to think about all the ways that conversations could go,
Yeah.
and like think about all that complexity. You don't have to do that anymore. So in many ways, like the new version of Rasa, which uses a system called CALM, conversational AI with language models, is kind of the way I always wanted Rasa to work. Right? It's like it's so much easier,
Interesting.
it's so much more powerful. Because the nice thing is that all the edge case handling, it just works out of the box. So people like change their mind about something, they interrupt one task and go to another, they cancel. They want to correct something they said earlier. They have a follow-up question, they have a contextual, like all this kind of complexity of all the ways that conversations can go. This stuff just works out of the box, and you can just write down the sort of minimal business logic. And so the sort of two products within the platform. So there's Rasa Pro, which is the pro code version of it, and there's Rasa Studio. And so Rasa Pro is it's free to use on your laptop, and it's free to use for a small deployment of up to 1,000 conversations a month. Beyond that, um, you have to buy a license. And then there's Studio, which is like the no code UI that sits on top of it, right? And currently, that's only in the paid product.
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of the split. And then, of course, if you want to use pure open source, there's still Browser open source if you want to use that, but that's still in the sort of NLU based paradigm, right? In the NLU based world.
And from a end customer perspective, what does your typical customer look like? Are these like large organizations who?
Mm-hmm.
So can you describe this?
Yeah, yeah. So a classic browser customer is a Fortune 500 B2C, some kind of consumer angle, and often has a brick and mortar element to their business, right? So I think, our primary verticals are banks and financial services, telcos, grocery and retail, insurance, things like that. And there's a long tail of other interesting, technology companies that use Rasa, and government organizations that use Rasa, and all kinds of other things. But those are sort of the primary ones. And they use it for a combination of text-based and voice-based automation, right? So both like traditional chatbots, but also the full, call me up and we can chat about things type of experience. So that always means that's also a thing that's changed when people ask about voice AI in 2017, 2018, it was often about like Alexa skills or Google Home or like IoT or those kinds of things. Now it's really firmly about like telephone, call center, automation kind of things, right? So that's also obviously a very big use case for Rasa.
Yeah, interesting. And I saw on the website you had Calm Summit recently, and I
Yeah,
saw some of the posts, and voice and text were like the two big themes there. So again, if reflecting on all the conversations which happened during the Calm Summit, what are some of the you know most exciting trends for you in this domain? And then, let's say if you have to start projecting, what do next 6 months, 12 months look
yeah,
like from an overall industry perspective? What would be some of those things?
for sure. So um, I would say that voice feels more real to many
Hmm.
people than it did in the past. It feels more doable. And the path traditionally has been we'll start with some text-based automation, and then once we're confident with that and we're getting good results, we'll start to do some voice, right? And so the set of customers that we've had historically that were doing voice-based automation with Rasa were, you know, are more advanced, let's say, are more advanced, technically advanced types of customers.
Hmm.
Um, the um, the demos and the things that people see now on social media, they've completely changed the perception of what this technology can do. People look at that,
Right.
their execs have seen it, right? It's
Yeah.
changed expectations of what these models can do. And so everyone says, okay, this is real now, right? And it might take 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, but like we should be able to do something like this, right? We should be able to ship something like this, to our customers, right? And there are all
Hmm.
sorts of, obviously interesting challenges, but one of the big things that everybody asks about now is, and for good reason, and it's very exciting, is of course like multimodal
Yeah.
models. So historically, to build a voice assistant, basically the starting point would be to build a chat assistant and then add
Voice
transcription,
to it. Yeah.
ASR, and voice generation on the other side of it, and kind of do everything in 3 steps. And with the new generation of models, you can start to think, okay, well, maybe we can get rid of some of those intermediate steps, right? Maybe
Yeah.
we can go straight from audio to understanding what we're supposed to do, or maybe we can even go from audio back to audio, right?
Back
And
to
so
audio. Yeah.
even in the last month or so, there have been a whole bunch of open source projects popping up about like audio to audio models, right? And again, super challenging to work with, of
Yeah.
course, because like these like audio tokens, right there, you now have like a continuous space that you're influencing what the voice sounds like, and it won't always pronounce names consistently within one conversation, and like it's not super steerable yet, but so it's very experimental at the moment, I would say, but everyone's very excited about it, right? And the big reason why this is a um, why this um, is a concern, especially for telephony, is the latency, right? So
Yeah.
if you run, I mean, if you use like a model like GPT-4 and you want to generate an answer, you're waiting like several seconds a lot of the time,
Correct.
right? And
Yeah.
if you're on the phone with a customer, anything longer than like half a second of latency before they start hearing audio back, it sounds odd. It sounds really awkward, right? And like
Correct.
1 second is really, really the hard limit where it feels like it's broken or not working anymore. And so you can't just like naively use these models and stitch them all together and like have a good voice experience. And some of these, I was playing with one recently. Some of these like audio to audio models, they're so fast that it sounds like they're interrupting you. You barely you barely finish pronouncing your
Right.
last word, and they're already talking back to you, right? So that's obviously very exciting, and leads potentially to much better UX. But then the other side of it, of course, is the increased sort of cost
Yeah.
of running something like that, right? So some of these models, it's cool, it's like very exciting, and it's cool that you can do it, but it's also one GPU per running session, right? And no enterprise is going to
Correct.
go and buy one GPU per concurrent call. You're
Per
really not,
session.
not,
Correct.
not saving any money at that point. So these models have to get smaller, and that's been a big theme for us at Rasa as well, right? So um, I could give you maybe a little sneak preview of something that's coming in the next Rasa release. So
Hmm.
when we built this new comm system, it's obviously very exciting. Like, look at what we can do with the next generation of models. Um, but what killed me about it was that when you got started and you worked through the Rasa tutorial, you had to like have an API key for OpenAI or some other third party, right? And that just felt so anti-Rasa to me. That just
Yeah.
felt so terribly, terribly wrong, right? So what we've been doing over the course of the year is building out recipes for people to fine tune their own models. And what we
Oh.
showed a couple of months ago, there's a blog post we should link in the show notes. With our fine tuning recipe, we can actually take Llama 8 billion and match the performance of GPT-4 for
Wow.
the Rasa specific application, right? Because of the way that Rasa uses LLMs, we use them in a very particular way, and you can match that performance. And that's a model that's small enough you can self-host. So in the next release of Rasa, when you go through the tutorial, the default model will not be OpenAI, will not be anything else. It'll just be a model on Hugging Face that we're hosting for you, but you can also download it and run it yourself. And you're not sort of relying on any third parties anymore, right? And that's obviously a big move because it's sort of history repeating itself in some way, right? That was our initial value proposition, was like, get away from those APIs and take control and run your own models again. And I'm very excited for that to be the default again. So that first experience for a developer coming to Rasa is not relying on any third party.
And that's really powerful that with the help of this framework, the performance has gone so up. And then just double clicking on it. So in the background, is that like a multi-agent system working along with these models to kind of reach a higher?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at describing how the comm system works. So, so as I said, the comm system says, okay, here's my business logic. It's minimal. It's just written of like, this is the information I need. These are the APIs I need to call. These are any branching decision points. But it doesn't say like, how is the user going to interact with it? How's the user going to talk to it, right?
Yeah.
And all that nuance, all that complexity of like having a conversation around it, that's handled with LLMs. So what Calm does is it takes that conversation and translates what the user is saying into what does that mean in the context of this business logic, right? So a great example of that is from one of our customers. You ask the user, are you traveling in economy class? And the user says, sadly. Right now, in an old like NLU-based world, that would have been very difficult to get right. But now, Calm does that very nicely. And what it implies is, of course, I'm setting this variable to true, right? So it translates that free-form conversation into some structured input. We call that commands, but it's just some structured representation, and that then executes your business logic, right? And that includes when it's like, hey, here's a digression, or we're switching topics, or whatever else it might be. It's sort of a very nice system that we built, together with conversation designers and other subject matter experts to say, what are the kinds of conversations that people really want to be able to have, and how do we have them, right? So it's kind of the opposite to, I would say, the sort of free-for-all approach of like, React agents or whatever, like let the LLM figure it out. Because, we know the use cases that people want to build things for with Rasa, and there's nothing to figure out. Like people know what the business logic is. They want it to be fast and reliable. And they want it to execute, the same way, and it's explainable and it's debuggable. And when you want to fix it or you want to compose it or reuse some pieces, like it's just, the business logic is known. The part that's actually complex is like, what are people going to do? How are people going to behave? How are they going to express themselves? What questions they're going to have? So that like, we use the powerful models for that side of it, because that's a difficult problem to figure out. And we have a very nice system for doing so, right? So it kind of gives you the marriage of the two worlds. And so because we use the LLMs in this very specific way of essentially translation, it's like translating between like human language and machine language. Because we use it in that very specific way, we're able to take much smaller models and match the performance of what something like a GPT-4 can do, right? If you're doing like an quote like agentic approach or like a React style agent or something like that, there was no hope of using an AI model, right?
Exactly,
like, I mean, if you want to go and like, I mean, it would be a very cool paper if you could do it, right? Like it would probably get accepted to a big conference. It'd be some interesting research, but it would also be a question of like, okay, how do we get, a really meaningful data set to do this kind of fine tuning for this type of performance, right? So.
And of course, the latency would be very different as well.
Yeah. Of course, because that, and so we'll share that as well. We should share that in the show notes. We did some benchmarking recently where we took like one of the very popular libraries for this sort of agentic type of implementation, and they had an official example bot of here's how you do a customer service bot with this like agentic graph based framework. And we said, okay, interesting. So we re-implemented it in Calm, right? Um, we use 80% fewer tokens when we do it in Calm, and it's 5 to 8x lower latency. So the
Wow.
like non-functional requirements really dramatically better, because we're not just like naively generating a paragraph of tokens about here's what I think the user wants, and like maybe it's this and maybe it's that, and then feed that back into another LLM. So it's much faster, much cheaper. But the other thing is, of course, the reliability, right? So even if you look at that example bot, it's like the official example of how to build a chatbot, but only about 1 in 5 conversations actually follow the task correctly. They kind of go off on one. The LLM gets real creative, starts offering things that aren't really, there's no APIs for it, and all this kind of stuff. So you kind of also go from, let's say, like 20% reliability to 100% reliability, right? Because you're not trusting the LLM to execute or guess your business logic, because you know your business logic. Hey, if I want to book a flight, I need these 3 pieces of information. I don't need to guess that every time, right? I just know what that is.
Interesting, very interesting. And just stepping back a bit. So overall, in the voice as an area, how do you see that evolving in the, let's say, near future? So in the sense that from a industrial use case,
Mm-hmm.
how far are we from, let's say, uh, you know this becoming the default first layer of conversations for agents, assuming I want it as a company, right? If
Yeah,
you don't want,
yeah.
obviously that's out. But assuming I'm looking for it, how far are we from uh, that point? And then if I'm a, let's say, Fortune 500 company
Yeah,
exploring this, what would be your advice?
yeah. Well, what I can tell you is that our customers, who are these large Fortune 500s, they have less control of this than they would like, because it's mostly sort of user, customer behavior driven. They would love
Mhm.
to have pushed, if they'd had the opportunity, they probably would have pushed everyone off the phone onto chat 10 years ago, because it's a
Correct.
lot
Yeah.
cheaper, right?
It
But
is.
people
Yeah.
pick up the phone and they expect to be able to pick up the phone and call you. So
Cool.
there's a
Correct.
meaningful segment, and people kind of bifurcate, right? Some people say, 100% would always prefer the text. I would never call up the phone unless you held a gun to my head. I really don't want to talk to people on the phone. Others are like, I just want to get the results. I want to talk to a human. Let me just, talk to somebody. So
Correct.
people are sort of split on that. And it's sort of user behavior driven. So you have to, if you want to achieve some meaningful level of automation on the telephony side, that's becoming a lot more doable. To reach a high level of quality, right? To really have a meaningful impact on automation, and not just do sort of some of the basics or some basic routing or some efficiency gains, but really end to end, like have that conversation. And again, like I think the demos that have made the news in the last year really inspired a lot of people to say, "Hey, this is possible for us," right? I think the other, so that's the sort of the stuff that's driven by consumer behavior. People come
Yeah.
in, they have a problem, they need it resolved. There's another set of use cases that's really interesting, which is um, where folks are kind of proactively driving people to engage with AI. So, a lot of our customers have inside their mobile app, they have their sort of flagship AI assistant, and it's very prevalent, and it has, deep links. So it sends you to different parts of the app to complete some actions and all kinds of things. It's a very sort of multimodal experience. And there, I
Yeah.
think if you think about voice, it's even more interesting, because now you're saying, okay, well, actually, why am I typing at all? Can I like
Correct.
help? Can you help me navigate this app and send me to the right place? Or I have a contextual question about the screen that I'm on, right? And I don't understand what it is, or it's bugging out, or whatever it is. That's a very rich and interesting experience that you can start to build, right? So I think we'll be seeing more and more of that. And then the interesting question as well is like, which parts of the processing are happening on the device and which parts are happening on the server,
On the
and like
cloud.
whatever,
Yeah.
because like many things are possible now, right? Like you can stream audio and do it all in
Correct.
the back, but you can like do more and more on the client side as well. And the operating systems on the phone are coming up with new APIs and better performing models. So um, I'm excited about that sort of truly rich experience of both having a screen as well as a voice conversation, right? Have a visual, auditory combined experience. And also potentially for those cases where people are calling up on the phone, right? Because maybe the way to resolve the issue, you need the user to take some action. And it's obviously much easier if you can like bring up the screen for them and show them, hey, this thing on the right, click there and do this kind of thing, right? So I think that's the next sort of evolution of multimodal that'll be even more useful for people and even more transformative. But there's a lot of work to do, to be honest, to get there. And there's a lot of
Yeah,
work to do for a lot of organizations to get even to a good level of chat automation.
correct, correct. No, that is true. It is. I mean, everyone feels like they are on a different point on this continuum, and then they'll have
Yeah.
their own set of challenges. But technologically, yes, what you described is, I think, clearly
One thing I'm really
possible.
excited about as well is that the way we used to control voice output was through a
Yeah.
system called SSML, where you add like you have text that you're asking to generate voice from, and you add little tags to it, right? Pause here, emphasize
Yeah.
this, question mark
Those
here,
are
this kind of
gone.
thing. And it feels so Neolithic now
Yeah.
when now you can say, well, I want the voice to sound like this. I want it to be cheerful. I want it to be serious and dramatic. I want it to have this type of accent. All these kinds of things, right? So this much more natural steering of generated speech is obviously amazing. I mean, it's a true breakthrough, right? Um, to be able to customize that just by writing a prompt. I mean, that's magical.
Correct, correct. That is so true. Just shifting, the topic a little bit. Today, what does your routine look like? And then,
Mm.
what is your style of working and then kind of leading the entire initiative?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, Maybe start with style of leading. I believe very strongly in writing. I like to write things down.
Interesting.
I like to
Hmm.
write blog posts. I like to write docs internally. It helps me clarify my thinking, but it also gives people something to point to rally around, to share with others.
Hmm.
Um, it's something that maybe took me too long to realize, but if I look back, the biggest impact that I've had on the organization and outside as well has been on sort of writing things that were widely read or sort of widely cited or people cared about. So that's something I believe in very strongly.
And
I do a mix of
what
things.
what is the logical point when you do it? Is it during the ideation journey, or when you think you have been thinking about it and you want to put a structure around it? So at what point do you kind of put down things on one blog post, and then what form does it take? Is it long form blog posts or
Mm,
short notes? So can you, because it really resonates, and then, we spend a lot of time
yeah,
doing articles. So just curious about where does this fall go
for
in
sure,
your
for sure.
book?
Usually it feels like there's a tension building up, and I don't know if anybody else feels the tension, but I
Right.
personally feel a tension building up that there's some set of ideas that are unresolved and sort of shifting in some,
Yeah.
there's some groundswell towards some
Hmm.
direction, and I want to just sort of write something down to organize my own
Okay.
thoughts and make it clear how I think about it, right? So there's a natural tension. So I just sort of, whenever that urge comes, to provide some clarity. It's much less effective when other people feel that and then they ask me, "Can you write something about this?" Like if it feels a little forced.
Yeah.
And so before I start writing anything, I have a very specific formula. There are three questions that I answer, and I ask
Hmm.
anybody else if they're writing something or publishing something at Rasa to do the same. It's three questions to answer. Number one, who's the audience? Number two, how do you want them to feel after reading it? Not what they should know. How do you want them to
Hmm.
feel? And the third is, what's the call to action? What should they be doing differently after reading it? Right.
After
And
reading.
if you can agree on the answers to those three questions, you have a much clearer conversation about, is this piece of writing, is it serving its purpose? Is it achieving what I want it to achieve? You know, how can we make it stronger? Like, and then you can read it and then you can say, would I with a straight face say that we're going to achieve these outcomes, right? And maybe not.
Yeah.
So maybe don't publish it, but or maybe you need another tweak or you need more work on it or something else like that. So um, yeah, I think having a very clear audience in mind is important.
Wow. Interesting. Well, that's very, very helpful because, in fact, the tension bit, I feel it myself. And there have been,
Right.
times when in middle of night you'll just, want to write down a few things and then
for
then
sure.
go back to it later on because otherwise it would just keep on playing in your mind. So.
Exactly that. So I have a blog post from I think 2020 where I
Mhm,
introduced a phrase called conversation driven development. And
mhm.
I wrote that blog post because I couldn't sleep at 3 o'clock in the morning on my phone. I just like sat up in my bed and I just wrote it. I just typed it out on my phone and then published it the next day. And it was just that sense of like the tension building up, and then you can't sleep, and
Correct.
you're like, well, I have clarity. Actually, this is what's going to be.
Yeah, uh, that's so true. That's so true. And broadly, how does that translate into your leadership style, your routine, and
Yeah.
everything with it?
Um, so I have a pretty light load when it comes to people management, which is great.
Mhm,
For the last few years, I've been a full IC, so not had any, and now I have like a little bit of people management responsibility, which gives me a lot of freedom to see where I can add a bit of value.
mhm.
And so I
Interesting.
try and spend about half my time with like product and engineering and teams internally figuring things out, right?
Mhm,
Figuring out what we should build, how it should work, how we can make it better, and then to try and spend about half my time outward facing. So doing things like this, having this conversation with you today, doing things like
mhm.
Com Summit, writing, for public consumption, spending lots of time with our customers, hearing, where our product's falling short, where we can make it better, what they would like it to do, those kinds of things. So I try and spend about half my time on each of those areas. But to be honest, it's like week over week, it's pretty dynamic, what I get pulled
Yeah,
into or what I work on. But I try to have a few consistent threads that last over multiple months. So it's
right.
not too reactive.
Yeah, interesting. And towards the end of these podcasts, we ask a few rapid fire questions with our guests,
Cool.
and the idea is to just get to know you better. So, any particular book which had a great influence on you, or which you would recommend to the listeners?
A book I loved a few years ago was called The Second Mountain,
Mhm,
and it describes a pattern among people who strive very hard for their careers and for their ambition and for their sort of prestige. And then
mhm.
something dramatic happens in their lives that causes a reset, and
Okay.
they reevaluate what their true priorities are. And that's the sort of
Wow.
second mountain. And yeah, it's quite a profound book, and definitely gave me some food for thought.
And did you define what second mountain for you after that?
No, I'm still looking for it. But it's
That
yeah,
would
I'm not one to like read a book and then dramatically change my life on the back of it, but it just becomes part of my thinking and my mental model, and
thinking.
I think about,
Understood.
when,
Yeah,
what is the right way to think about that, right? And focusing on others over yourself, focusing on your immediate community over, the whole world, and where you can have a true impact.
yeah, yeah. If you were not, doing Rasa now, what would you be working on, or what are some of the opportunities which excite you?
Well, I mean, yeah, there's a question of like, what would I be working on if I didn't have to work, and there's a question of like, what are opportunities that excite me? I'm a great lover of history,
Mhm.
and I would love. I'm really fascinated by sort of cuneiform and clay tablets and ancient
Interesting.
texts, so I would love
Mhm.
to learn to read those. I think that would be a very interesting
Wow,
thing to do.
interesting. And what does your typical weekend look like?
Well, I have a little baby, so
Oh,
it's
wow.
it's time for dad to spend time with the baby. So this weekend we went, and there's a planetarium in Berlin, and they
Mhm.
have a show on for babies where it's a cool projection of like shapes and classical music, and so my daughter and I went there. It was great fun.
Wow, great. Thanks a lot, Ellen, for sharing those insights, your perspective, and I think tons of learning for the listeners and the community members. So thanks a lot for taking time out
Yeah,
and
thanks, Kunal. Thanks for having me on the show, and thanks for all the insightful, provocative questions. And yeah, I hope people enjoyed the conversation and found it worthwhile.
sure. Thanks a lot.
Hope you enjoyed this episode. Do let us know your feedback in the comments below. For me, a few things which stand out from the discussions are Alan's preference to write things down as a way not only to structure his thoughts, but also to set standards and documentation in his work. Secondly, the excitement about voice AI in coming years. I think it feels obvious, but it doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. So keep that in mind. And thirdly, a common trait which stands out in some of the most exciting startups in AI space is that they started when the previous generation of AI, namely the deep learning models, were becoming good. But they got traction and scale in the next generation of models. I think it is a great insight. So, for all the startups that are now building new tools, you may or may not see success immediately. But if you keep at it, you might see your inflection points in the journey in the next few years and in the next waves of AI. So stay at it. Signing off this episode. See you in the next one. Thank you.
think about the value of the open sourceness of it, right? Like what is the specific value that people are getting from that? So the problem we were solving was like it's searching across your stuff that's in your Dropbox and your Google Drive and like your
Got it.
Trello and your GitHub, like all of your things that are
Mhm.
in different places. So that's a problem we were trying to solve. What you include in open source and what you charge for, it completely depends on like what the product is and what they use, how people consume it and what they want it for, right? There are actually hundreds of academic papers that cite Rasa. So lots of people use it for interesting, academic applications, which are things that I never would have dreamt of myself in 100 years. It's even more interesting because now you're saying, okay, well, actually, why am I typing at all? Can I like
Got it.
help? Can you help me navigate this app and send me to the right place? Or I have a contextual question about the screen that I'm on, right? And I don't understand what it is, or it's bugging out, or whatever it is. That's a very rich and interesting experience that you can start to build.